He gave her a key on their wedding night. But it didn't open his home, it opened the part of his life he never intended anyone to see. The chandeliers above the Caldwell estate shimmered like frozen stars, casting soft gold across marble floors that had never known a single imperfection. And as Naomi Brooks stood at the center of it all in a gown that felt both beautiful and borrowed, she realized something unsettling. The silence was louder than any celebration could have been. Guests had already drifted away, their laughter fading into the distance like a memory that didn't belong to her, and the man who was now her husband stood a few feet away, adjusting the cuff of his tailored black suit with the same precision he applied to billion-dollar deals. Ethan Caldwell didn't look at her when he spoke. "This won't be complicated," he said, his voice calm, measured, untouched by anything resembling warmth. Naomi held her breath for a moment, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the kind that told her when a moment mattered more than it appeared. She had signed the agreement, every clause, every condition, every line that turned what should have been a beginning into something far more controlled, far more defined. This marriage had rules. Distance. Privacy. No questions. She had accepted them all without negotiation, because survival sometimes wore the mask of agreement. Ethan reached into his pocket, and for a brief second, the movement felt almost symbolic, as if he were about to offer something meaningful, something human. But when he placed the small object into her palm, the reality settled in with quiet certainty. A key. Cold. Silver. Weightless, yet somehow heavy enough to shift the air between them. Naomi looked down at it, her fingers closing slowly, feeling the edges, the grooves, the absence of explanation. "What does it open?" she asked, her voice steady, her tone respectful but unafraid. That was the thing about Naomi Brooks. She had learned long ago that dignity didn't need to be loud to be undeniable. Ethan finally met her eyes, and for the first time that night, something flickered there. Not softness, not quite, but something that suggested depth beneath the surface. "Not this house," he replied. The answer hung between them, unfinished, intentional. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him, not as a wife would study a husband, but as someone trying to understand the architecture of a locked door. "Then where?" she asked. Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to be noticed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a subtle edge, the kind that drew lines rather than erased them. "Somewhere you've never been," he said. A pause followed, not awkward but deliberate, as if silence itself was part of the contract. Naomi didn't press further. She didn't ask why. She didn't demand meaning where none was offered. Instead, she closed her fingers around the key and slipped it into the small satin clutch at her side, the motion graceful, controlled, as if she were placing away a secret she hadn't yet earned the right to understand. The staff moved quietly in the background, clearing glasses, dimming lights, restoring the house to its pristine stillness, and Naomi realized that this place, this mansion, this life, wasn't designed to hold warmth. It was designed to hold order. Control. Distance. Ethan stepped past her, his presence brushing the air without quite touching her, and for a brief moment, she caught the faint scent of cedar and something colder, something sharper, like winter pressed into fabric. "You'll have everything you need here," he said, not turning back. "Just remember what we agreed to." Naomi nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "I remember," she replied softly. But as she stood there alone, the echo of his words settling into the walls around her, she understood something else entirely. This marriage wasn't about what she would be given. It was about what she would never be allowed to take. Her gaze drifted toward the grand staircase, then to the endless hallway beyond it, doors lining both sides like closed chapters in a story she hadn't been invited to read, and yet, in her hand, or rather, now hidden at her side, was something that didn't belong to those rules. A key that opened a place she had never been. A place he had never explained. A place that, for reasons he refused to name, he had trusted her to find. Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing not in defeat, but in quiet resolve. Because she had learned something else, long before she ever stepped into a world like this. Some doors were not meant to be forced open. But some keys were never given by accident. And somewhere, beyond the walls of a house that wasn't truly a home. A door was waiting for her. Morning arrived without ceremony, slipping through the floor-to-ceiling windows and pale gray light that softened nothing and revealed everything. And Naomi Brooks stood alone in a bedroom that felt more like a carefully staged photograph than a place where life was meant to unfold, her reflection staring back at her from the mirror with a calm she had practiced for years, the kind of calm that held steady even when the ground beneath it shifted. The dress from the night before had been replaced with something simpler, a soft cream blouse and tailored slacks, chosen not for impression but for clarity, and yet even in simplicity, she looked like she belonged in the space, which somehow made the silence feel even more deliberate. Downstairs, the house moved with quiet precision, staff preparing breakfast that would be served whether she ate it or not, schedules already arranged for a life she had only just entered, and somewhere within those walls, Ethan Caldwell existed as both presence and absence, a man whose footsteps could be heard but whose thoughts remained firmly out of reach. Naomi descended the staircase slowly, her hand gliding along the polished railing, her gaze tracing the architecture as if memorizing it, not out of admiration, but out of awareness, because every corner of this house carried intention, and intention always meant something was being protected. The dining room was exactly as she expected, long table, perfect settings, sunlight filtered through sheer curtains that softened the edges of everything except the distance between two chairs at opposite ends. Ethan was already there, seated with a tablet in hand, his attention fixed on numbers that likely shaped markets far beyond the walls of this estate, and when he looked up, it was not with surprise, but with acknowledgement, as if her presence had already been calculated into the morning. "You should eat," he said, his tone even, not unkind, but not inviting either. Naomi took her seat without hesitation, her movements quiet, controlled, her posture reflecting not submission but self-possession. "I will," she replied, reaching for a cup of coffee, the warmth of it grounding in a way the room was not. For a few moments, there was only the sound of silverware and distant city noise, filtered down to something almost unreal, and then Naomi spoke again, not to break the silence, but to place something within it. "There is another house," she said, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his without challenge. Ethan paused, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause most people would miss. But Naomi did not miss anything. "There are several," he answered, returning his attention to the tablet, but the air had shifted, just slightly, just enough. Naomi set her cup down gently, the sound soft but intentional. "This key does not belong to this one," she said. Ethan's jaw tightened, not visibly enough to be called tension, but enough to register as control. He placed the tablet aside, folding his hands with a precision that mirrored every other aspect of his life. "Then you should keep it somewhere safe," he replied. It was not a denial. It was not an explanation. It was a boundary. Naomi nodded once, accepting the line for what it was, but not mistaking it for an answer. "I understand," she said. And she did, more than he realized, because she recognized the language he was speaking, the language of someone who had built walls so carefully that even their cracks were intentional. The rest of the morning unfolded without further conversation, Ethan leaving for the office with the same measured efficiency he applied to everything, his absence filling the house just as completely as his presence had, and Naomi found herself standing once again in the quiet that defined this place, the key now resting in her hand instead of her bag, its surface catching the light in a way that felt almost deliberate. She turned it slowly between her fingers, studying it not as an object, but as a question, because nothing about Ethan Caldwell suggested carelessness, and yet this had been given without instruction, without condition, without clarity, which meant it was none of those things. Naomi moved through the house, not searching, but observing, her steps unhurried, her thoughts precise, until she reached the study, a room lined with books that spoke of strategy and legacy, of decisions made in silence and consequences carried in public, and on the far wall, a map, framed and understated, marked with locations that held meaning beyond geography. Her eyes lingered on it, tracing the points, connecting nothing and everything, until one detail stood out, not because it was highlighted, but because it was not a location just outside the city, unmarked, unspoken, almost invisible unless someone was looking for what was not being shown. Naomi exhaled slowly, her fingers closing around the key once more, the weight of it settling differently now, not heavier, but clearer, and for the first time since the night before, she allowed herself a small shift, not in emotion, but in intention, because she understood something that could not be written into any contract. Some doors were not meant to be opened quickly, but they were meant to be opened by someone who knew how to listen to what silence was trying to say, and somewhere beyond the reach of this perfectly controlled life, there was a place that had been waiting longer than she had been invited, a place that did not belong to the rules of this house. And as Naomi Brooks stood there in the quiet certainty of her own mind, she made a decision that did not need to be spoken. She would not force the door, but she would find it, and when she did, she would understand why he had given her the key in the first place. The car engine hummed softly beneath Naomi Brooks as the city unfolded in polished glass and quiet ambition around her, each block passing like a page she had already read but never truly entered, and as she followed the subtle coordinates she had memorized rather than written down, she realized that this was not curiosity driving her forward, it was recognition, the kind that did not need permission to exist. The address had not been marked on Ethan Caldwell's map, not officially, not with the bold certainty of ownership, but its absence had been louder than any label, and now, as the skyline gave way to something quieter, more restrained, she understood that whatever she was about to find did not belong to his public world. The road narrowed as she moved further from the city's center, lined with trees that filtered the afternoon light into soft patterns across the pavement, and the neighborhood shifted from towering statements of wealth to something older, something that did not need to prove anything to anyone. When she finally slowed the car, it was not because of a grand gate or a security checkpoint, but because of something far more subtle, a house that did not call attention to itself, yet held a presence that was impossible to ignore. It stood set back from the road, framed by tall oaks and a wrought iron fence that showed signs of age rather than neglect, the kind of place that had been lived in, not displayed. Naomi turned off the engine, the sudden quiet settling around her like a hell breath, and for a moment she simply sat there, her hand resting on the steering wheel, the key in her pocket pressing gently against her side as if reminding her that this was not an accident. She stepped out of the car, the air cooler here, touched with the scent of leaves and something faintly familiar, something that felt less like wealth and more like memory. Each step toward the gate was measured, not hesitant, but aware, and when she reached it, she paused just long enough to notice the details others might overlook, the worn edge of the metal, the way the hinges moved without resistance, the quiet invitation of a place that had never been meant to keep people out. The path curved slightly, leading her toward the front door, and as she approached, she saw it, the lock, simple, unremarkable, and yet undeniably the match to the key she had been given without explanation. Naomi reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cool metal, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single point of connection, the space between question and answer. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She simply placed the key into the lock and turned it, the sound soft, definitive, like something long closed finally acknowledging the right presence. The door opened without resistance, revealing not darkness, but a quiet, filtered light that seemed to hold its own kind of stillness, and as Naomi stepped inside, she immediately understood that this was not a forgotten place, it was a preserved one. The air carried a faint trace of cedar and something softer beneath it, something that lingered like a memory that refused to fade, and the room before her was not grand in the way Ethan's estate was grand, it was intimate, intentional, filled with objects that had been chosen not for display, but for meaning. A sofa sat near a window that overlooked the trees, its fabric worn just enough to suggest use rather than age. A bookshelf lined one wall, not with decorative volumes, but with titles that had been read, their spines softened, their pages likely marked by moments that mattered. Naomi moved slowly, her gaze taking in each detail, not searching for anything specific, but understanding that everything here was specific by design. On a small table near the center of the room, there was a framed photograph, simple, unassuming, and yet it drew her attention with a quiet insistence she could not ignore. She stepped closer, her breath steady, her movements deliberate, and when she reached it, she looked down. The man in the photograph was unmistakable, younger, less guarded, his expression open in a way she had never seen, and beside him stood a woman, her smile warm, her presence effortless, and between them, held gently, was a child, no older than 3, looking directly at the camera with a kind of unfiltered joy that did not ask for permission to exist. Naomi did not react outwardly, her expression remaining composed, but something within her shifted, not in shock, but in understanding, because this was not just a place he had hidden, it was a life he had sealed away. She set the photograph back exactly as she had found it, her fingers careful, respectful, and as she straightened, her eyes moved across the room once more, seeing it now not as a mystery, but as a message. Ethan Caldwell had not given her access to his wealth, his power, or even his trust in the way most people would define it. He had given her access to something far more guarded, something that existed beneath all of those things, something that had been locked not because it was unimportant, but because it mattered too much. Naomi exhaled slowly, the quiet of the house settling around her not as emptiness, but as presence, and for the first time since she had stepped into his world she felt something that did not belong to the contract, not obligation, not expectation, but clarity. Because now she understood the difference between a door that was meant to keep people out and a door that was waiting for the right person to open it. And as she stood there in the stillness of a life paused but not erased, Naomi Brooks realized that whatever came next would not be written in the terms he had set, it would be written in the truth he had tried to protect. The silence inside the house did not feel empty, it felt deliberate, as if every object had agreed to remain exactly where it was left, holding its breath across the years, and Naomi Brooks moved through it with a quiet awareness that this was not a place meant to be disturbed, but a place that had been waiting to be understood. Her steps carried her further into the space, past the living room where the photograph still rested untouched, and into a hallway lined with doors that were slightly ajar, not closed in secrecy, but left open in a way that suggested nothing here had ever needed to hide, only to remain unseen. She paused at the first doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame before she stepped inside, and what she found was not grand, not curated, but personal in a way that made her slow even more. It was a bedroom, modest in size, with soft light filtering through pale curtains, and on the far wall, shelves filled with children's books, their colors faded just enough to reveal time had passed but not erased them. Naomi's gaze moved carefully across the room, taking in the small bed neatly made, the quilt folded with precision, the stuffed animal placed at the corner as if someone had set it down with the intention of returning later. There was no dust, no sign of neglect, only preservation, and that distinction settled into her chest with a quiet weight. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the bookshelf, tracing the titles without pulling any free, respecting the order that had been kept long after it was needed. This was not storage. This was memory held in place. A soft exhale escaped her as she turned, her eyes catching on something near the window, a small wooden desk with a single chair, and on its surface, a drawing, framed simply, the kind of drawing only a child could create, bright colors, uneven lines, a house beneath a wide blue sky, 3 figures standing side by side, holding hands. Naomi did not need to ask who they were. She already knew. The man was drawn taller, the woman beside him smiling, and the child between them colored in a shade that suggested joy rather than accuracy. And above them, in uneven letters, a word written with careful effort. Family. Naomi stood there for a moment longer, her expression unchanged, but her understanding deepening, because this was not just a past Ethan had hidden, this was a version of himself that had once existed fully, openly, without the distance she had come to know. She stepped back into the hallway, her movements unhurried, her mind steady, and continued forward until she reached the last door at the end, slightly more closed than the others, not locked, but not entirely open either. She rested her hand against it, feeling the faint resistance before she pushed it gently, the door giving way with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The room beyond was different. Not in design, but in presence. This was where time had not just paused, it had settled. A larger bedroom, the bed neatly made, the linens untouched, and along the far wall, a series of framed photographs, not arranged for display, but for remembrance, each one capturing moments that had once been ordinary and were now irreplaceable. Naomi stepped inside, her gaze moving from one image to the next, Ethan younger, his expression unguarded, the same woman from before beside him, her hand resting naturally against his arm, their connection effortless, and in several frames, the child, growing, changing, laughing, existing in a way that filled the space even now. There was no date, no explanation, but none was needed. The room spoke clearly enough. Naomi's eyes settled on the nightstand, where a single object rested, a watch, simple, worn, not the kind Ethan would wear now, but the kind someone keeps when time itself becomes something they measure differently. She did not touch it. She did not move anything. Instead, she stood there, absorbing the quiet truth of a life that had not disappeared, but had been carefully placed beyond reach. And then, without warning, the stillness shifted. It was subtle, not a sound, not a movement she could name, but something that altered the air, the kind of shift that comes when presence returns to a place that has been alone for too long. Naomi did not turn immediately. She did not react with surprise or fear. She simply closed her eyes for a brief second, grounding herself in the understanding that whatever happened next would not change what she had already seen. When she finally turned, Ethan Caldwell stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his posture still, but his presence unmistakably different from the man she had left that morning. There was no anger in the way he looked at her. There was something far more controlled, far more dangerous in its restraint. "You were not supposed to come here," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying no raised tone yet holding a weight that filled the room. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her own calm unshaken, not defiant, but grounded in something he had not anticipated. "You gave me the key," she replied. The words were simple, but they did not challenge, they clarified. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes flickering for just a moment toward the space around them, the photographs, the bed, the life he had kept sealed, and when he looked back at her, the distance returned, sharper now, more defined. "That does not mean you were meant to understand it," he said. Naomi held his gaze, her voice soft but precise, the kind that did not need volume to carry truth. "Then why did you give it to me?" The question settled between them, not as accusation, but as inevitability, and for the first time since she had known him, Ethan Caldwell did not have an immediate answer. The question did not echo in the room, it settled, quiet and precise, like something that had always been waiting to be asked, and Ethan Caldwell stood motionless for a fraction longer than usual, the kind of stillness that revealed more than any reaction could have, his gaze fixed on Naomi Brooks not with anger, but with something far more guarded, something that suggested the answer existed, but had not been spoken in a very long time. He stepped into the room slowly, the door behind him closing with a soft, almost respectful sound, as if even the house understood that what remained inside it was not meant to be interrupted carelessly, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching not as tension, but as recognition. "Because you would not misuse it," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, each word measured as if it had been chosen carefully before it was allowed to exist. Naomi did not move, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, but her eyes held his, not searching, not challenging, simply present. "You do not know me well enough to decide that," she replied. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of something he could not easily deny. "I know enough," he said. The answer was incomplete, and they both understood it. Naomi took a slow breath, her gaze shifting briefly toward the photographs along the wall before returning to him, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "This was your life," she said. It was not a question. Ethan's eyes followed hers for a moment, landing on a frame that held a version of himself he no longer allowed to exist, and when he spoke again, there was a subtle shift in his tone, not vulnerability, not quite, but something closer to truth than he had allowed before. "It was," he said. Naomi nodded once, accepting the past as fact, not pressing for details he had not offered, because she understood that some stories were not told through explanation, but through what remained behind. "And now it is not," she said quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened, the control returning sharper now, more defined, as if the space itself demanded it. "No," he replied. The word carried finality, but not closure. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, giving him space without stepping away, her presence steady, unintrusive, and in that small movement, something shifted again, something subtle but undeniable, because she was not trying to take anything from him, she was simply refusing to pretend she had not seen it. "You did not give me this key by accident," she said. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze lowering for just a second before lifting again, and in that brief moment, the distance between who he was and who he had been felt closer than it had in years. "I do not make accidents," he said. Naomi's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something that acknowledged the truth in his words. "Then you made a choice," she said. The room seemed to hold that statement, the weight of it settling into the space around them, and Ethan turned his head slightly, his eyes moving once more across the room, across the life he had sealed away, before returning to her with a look that was no longer entirely unreadable. "I made a decision," he corrected. Naomi inclined her head, accepting the distinction. "About me," she said. It was not pride. It was not assumption. It was clarity. Ethan did not answer immediately, and in that silence, something else became apparent, something Naomi recognized not from his words, but from what he had not denied. He had chosen her. Not as a wife in the traditional sense. Not as a partner in the way the world would understand. But as someone who could stand in this room and not break it. The realization did not change her expression, but it settled into her with quiet certainty, and for the first time since this marriage had begun, the contract felt incomplete, not because it had been violated, but because it had never accounted for this. Naomi glanced once more at the photograph on the nightstand, then back at Ethan, her voice steady, her tone respectful, but grounded in something deeper than obligation. "You have been protecting this," she said. Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly, but he did not deny it. "Yes," he replied. Naomi nodded slowly, her understanding aligning with something he had not yet spoken. "Not from the world," she continued. "From yourself." The words did not accuse. They revealed. Ethan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of change that would be invisible to anyone not paying attention, but Naomi saw it clearly, because it was not about what he showed, it was about what he allowed to surface, even for a moment. "You should not be here," he said again, but this time, the words carried something different, not just distance, but something closer to restraint, as if he were not pushing her away, but holding something back. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, unwavering. "I am already here," she said. The truth of it settled between them, undeniable, and for a brief moment, the room felt less like a place of memory and more like a point of decision, a place where something long held in silence had been seen, acknowledged, and could no longer be ignored. Ethan turned away slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the dresser, his posture still controlled, but the stillness itself carrying a different weight now, one that suggested not just control, but conflict. Naomi did not move toward him. She did not close the distance. Instead, she stepped back, giving him the space he had always maintained, but not retreating from what had been uncovered. "I will leave," she said quietly. Ethan did not respond, but his hand tightened slightly against the wood, the smallest sign that her presence, her understanding, had already altered something he had spent years keeping unchanged. Naomi turned toward the door, her steps measured, her movements calm, and as she reached the threshold, she paused, not to look back, but to speak once more, her voice soft, but carrying a clarity that did not need to be repeated. "You did not give me a boundary," she said. "You gave me a truth." And then she stepped out, leaving the door open behind her, not wide, not closed, but just enough to change the way the room felt, just enough to suggest that what had been locked away no longer existed in silence alone. The drive back felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Naomi Brooks sat behind the wheel with both hands steady, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, yet her mind not racing, not overwhelmed, but aligning, placing each piece she had seen into a quiet order that made sense without needing explanation. The city slowly reappeared around her, glass towers rising like statements of certainty, noise returning in layers that felt almost artificial after the stillness she had just left behind, and by the time she pulled into the circular driveway of the Caldwell estate, she understood something with absolute clarity. Nothing in that house had changed, and yet everything inside her had. She stepped out of the car with the same composed grace she had carried since the beginning, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but the key in her hand no longer felt like a question, it felt like an answer she was not required to speak. Inside, the house greeted her with its usual perfection, every surface untouched, every detail exactly as it had been, as if time here moved differently, as if nothing was allowed to shift unless it had been decided in advance, and Naomi moved through it with quiet ease, her steps measured, her presence neither intrusive nor invisible. She did not return to the bedroom. She did not retreat into the role she had been assigned. Instead, she walked into the living room and paused near the window, the city stretching out beyond her in sharp lines and distant motion, her reflection faint against the glass. A woman standing in a life that had been constructed with precision, but not with truth. Hours passed without announcement, the light outside shifting from pale afternoon to the deeper tones of evening, and when the sound of the front door finally broke the silence, Naomi did not turn immediately, because she already knew it was him. Ethan Caldwell entered the house with the same controlled presence he carried everywhere, his movements efficient, his expression composed. But the moment his gaze found her, there was a pause, slight, but unmistakable, as if he had not expected her to still be exactly where she was. "You came back," he said. It was not relief. It was not accusation. It was observation. Naomi turned then, meeting his eyes without hesitation, her voice calm, her tone even. "I live here," she replied. The answer was simple, but it shifted something in the space between them, because it was the first time she had claimed the house as anything more than a temporary arrangement. Ethan removed his jacket slowly, placing it over the back of a chair with precise care, his gaze not leaving her. "Most people would have questions," he said. Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding. "Most people would ask them to be answered," she said. Ethan's brow tightened just slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of a difference he had not anticipated. "And you?" he asked. Naomi's eyes held his, steady, grounded, her voice soft but clear. "I already have the answer," she said. The words settled into the room, quiet but undeniable, and for a moment, Ethan said nothing, his gaze searching hers not for defiance, but for something else, something he could not immediately define. "You think you understand it," he said finally. Naomi did not move, did not step closer, did not shift away. "I understand why you gave it to me," she replied. Ethan's expression hardened slightly, the control returning in a way that felt familiar, almost automatic. "Then explain it," he said. It was not a challenge. It was a test. Naomi took a slow breath, her gaze unwavering, her words measured with the same precision he used in his own world. "Because I would not try to take anything from it," she said. "I would not try to change it. I would not pretend it does not exist. And I would not use it against you." Each sentence landed with quiet certainty, not forceful, not emotional, but grounded in something deeper than assumption. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt, and when she finished, the silence that followed felt different from the ones before, less controlled, more exposed. "You gave it to me," Naomi continued, her voice softer now, but no less steady. "Because you needed someone to see it without breaking it." The truth of it lingered in the air, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but undeniable in its simplicity, and Ethan looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a solution, not as an arrangement, but as something that did not fit into the structures he had built. That is not your role, he said, but the words lacked the firmness they once carried. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. It was not in the contract. She agreed. But you gave me the key anyway. The room fell quiet again, the city lights now glowing beyond the glass, reflections shifting across the walls in soft patterns that made the space feel less rigid, less absolute, and Ethan turned away slightly, his hand resting against the back of the chair where his jacket lay, his posture still controlled, but no longer entirely distant. You should not go back there, he said, his voice lower now, less directive, more restrained. Naomi watched him for a moment, her expression unchanged, her understanding clear. I will not go where I am not invited, she replied. It was not submission. It was respect. Ethan's hand tightened slightly against the chair, the smallest indication that her words had reached something he had not intended to expose, and for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by something quieter, something more fragile. Naomi turned back toward the window, her gaze settling once more on the city beyond, the key still in her hand, no longer hidden, no longer questioned, simply held, and as the silence returned, it no longer felt like something that separated them, it felt like something that connected two truths either of them had planned to share. The night settled over the city like a quiet agreement, lights stretching across the skyline in steady lines of gold and white, and inside the Caldwell estate, the silence no longer felt untouched, it felt altered, as if something invisible had shifted its position and refused to return to where it once belonged. Naomi Brooks remained by the window long after their conversation ended, her reflection faint against the glass, her posture relaxed but deliberate, and in her hand, the key rested not as a secret, but as a truth she had already accepted. Behind her, Ethan Caldwell had not moved immediately, his presence lingering in the room with a stillness that carried weight, and when he finally stepped away, it was not with the certainty that usually defined him, but with something quieter, something that suggested thought rather than decision. The following morning arrived with the same polished routine the house demanded, sunlight cutting through the space in clean lines, staff moving with practiced efficiency, everything appearing unchanged, yet Naomi noticed the difference in the smallest details. The way Ethan's coffee remained untouched for a few minutes longer than usual, the way his gaze lingered not on his tablet, but somewhere beyond it, as if his focus had shifted inward. She took her seat across from him, her movements calm, her presence steady, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer a barrier, but a shared awareness either had defined. There is a meeting tonight, Ethan said eventually, his voice measured, but lacking its usual edge. Naomi looked up, her expression neutral, attentive. A charity gala, he continued. It requires both of us. The word requires settled between them, not as obligation, but as structure, something familiar, something safe. Naomi inclined her head slightly. What is expected? She asked. Ethan's gaze met hers, direct, controlled, but there was something else beneath it now, something less rigid, less distant. Presence, he said. Appearance. Nothing more. Naomi nodded once, accepting the simplicity of it, understanding the unspoken layer beneath, that this was part of the world he operated in, a world where perception held weight equal to truth. The evening arrived with the same precision as everything else in his life, the black car waiting outside, the city alive with energy that contrasted sharply with the quiet control inside the house, and as Naomi stepped into the event space. Hours later, the shift was immediate, the air filled with conversation, music, the subtle hum of influence and expectation. She moved beside Ethan with effortless composure, her presence drawing attention not because she demanded it, but because she did not, her elegance quiet, her expression calm, and for the first time, the role she occupied did not feel assigned, it felt chosen. Conversations formed and dissolved around them, introductions made, acknowledgments exchanged, and through it all, Naomi observed, not with curiosity, but with clarity, understanding that this world, like the house, was structured, controlled, designed to show only what was meant to be seen. It was not until later in the evening, when the crowd had shifted and the conversations had softened into smaller circles, that the moment changed. A woman approached, her presence sharp, polished, her confidence unmistakable, and when her gaze settled on Ethan, there was recognition there, but also something else, something more personal. "Ethan," she said, her voice smooth, her smile practiced. "I was not expecting to see you here." Ethan's posture stiffened slightly, the smallest shift, but enough for Naomi to notice, and when he responded, his tone returned to something closer to what she had first known. "Victoria," he said. The name carried history, though not all of it spoken. Victoria's gaze moved to Naomi, assessing, measuring, her smile unchanged but her eyes sharpening just slightly. "And this must be your wife," she said. Naomi met her gaze without hesitation, her own expression calm, unshaken. "Naomi Brooks," she said, her voice even, grounded. Victoria inclined her head, her smile widening just enough to suggest something beneath it. "Of course," she replied. "I have heard very little about you." The words were polite. The meaning was not. Naomi did not react, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "That is understandable," she said. "I have only recently become part of this world." Ethan's gaze flickered toward her, brief, unreadable, and then back to Victoria, who studied Naomi for a moment longer before shifting her attention once more. "Some things," Victoria said, her tone light but pointed, "are better left where they belong." The statement lingered, subtle, but intentional, and for a moment, the space between the three of them held a tension that was not loud, but precise. Naomi understood it immediately, not as a challenge, but as a reflection of something she had already seen. The idea that certain parts of life were meant to remain untouched, unseen, controlled. She turned slightly, her gaze meeting Victoria's fully now, her voice calm, her tone measured with quiet certainty. "Some things," Naomi replied, "are only protected because no one has understood them yet." The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. They carried truth, and truth did not require force. Victoria's smile faltered for the briefest moment, her composure intact, but her eyes shifting with something that had not been there before, and Ethan, standing between them, remained silent, his expression unreadable, but his presence no longer entirely detached. The moment passed, as all moments in that world did, absorbed back into the rhythm of the evening, but something had changed, something subtle, something that could not be undone, because Naomi Brooks was no longer simply standing beside Ethan Caldwell, she was standing within a truth that others had never been allowed to see, and for the first time, it was no longer hidden behind a closed door. The music faded into something softer as the evening unfolded, conversations blending into a quiet rhythm that carried the weight of influence without ever raising its voice, and Naomi Brooks stood beside Ethan Caldwell with the same composed stillness she had carried since the moment she stepped into his world. But now, the space around her responded differently, as if something unseen had shifted its alignment. The encounter with Victoria had passed on the surface, absorbed into the polite exchanges that defined that environment, yet its presence lingered beneath, subtle, persistent, like a note that refused to fully resolve. Naomi did not dwell on it. She did not replay the words or search for hidden meanings. She understood them the moment they were spoken, and once understood, they no longer required attention. Ethan, however, was quieter than before, his responses measured, his gaze more distant, and as the final conversations of the evening began to dissolve, he placed a hand lightly at Naomi's back, guiding her toward the exit with a gesture that was neither possessive nor detached, but something in between, something unpracticed. The car ride home was silent, not with tension, but with thought, the city lights passing in long reflections across the windows, and Naomi sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, while beside her, Ethan's stillness felt different from the kind he had perfected, less controlled, more occupied. When they arrived, the house greeted them with the same quiet precision it always had, the doors opening, the lights already set, the air untouched by the world outside, and Naomi stepped inside without hesitation, her movements smooth, her gaze forward, as if the transition between worlds had not unsettled her in the slightest. Ethan followed, his steps slower, and when the door closed behind them, The silence that filled the space was no longer empty, it was weighted with everything that had not been said. "You should not have said that," he said finally, his voice low, his tone controlled, but carrying something beneath it that had not been there before. Naomi turned to face him, her expression calm, her eyes steady. "Which part?" she asked. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze holding hers with a sharpness that suggested restraint rather than anger. "The part where you decided what belongs to be understood," he replied. Naomi considered his words for a brief moment, not defensive, not dismissive, simply precise in her response. "I did not decide," she said. "I recognized." The distinction settled between them, and for a moment, Ethan did not respond, his gaze shifting away as if the answer did not align with the structure he relied on. "That is not your place," he said. The words were familiar, an echo of the boundaries he had set from the beginning, but they no longer carried the same certainty. Naomi inclined her head slightly, her voice soft, but grounded in something that did not waver. "Then why do you keep placing me there?" she asked. The question was not forceful. It did not need to be. It existed as fact, and Ethan's silence confirmed it more clearly than any answer could have. He turned away, his hand running once through his hair in a rare gesture that broke the precision of his usual composure, and for a moment, the man who stood before her was not the version the world knew, but something closer to the one she had seen in the quiet house beyond the city. "You think this changes something?" he said after a moment, his voice lower now, less controlled, more reflective. Naomi watched him, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. "It already has," she replied. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders settling slightly as if the weight of something long held was shifting, not disappearing, but moving into a different place. "You should not go back there," he said again, but this time, the words lacked authority, replaced instead by something closer to request. Naomi did not move closer. She did not step away. She remained where she was, her voice calm, her tone respectful. "I told you," she said. "I will not go where I am not invited." Ethan's gaze returned to hers, searching, measuring, and for a moment the distance between them felt smaller, not erased, but altered. "And if I never invite you?" he asked. Naomi held his gaze without hesitation, her expression composed, her voice steady. "Then it will remain yours," she said. "As it should." The simplicity of her answer settled into the room with a quiet finality, and something in Ethan's expression shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to see. It was not relief. It was not acceptance. It was something more complex, something that existed between control and surrender, between what he had built and what he could no longer fully contain. Naomi turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance, and in that moment, she understood something that did not need to be spoken. She was not here to change his world, she was here because he had already allowed something within it to change. Behind her, Ethan remained still, his presence no longer distant, no longer entirely guarded, and though either of them moved closer, the space between them no longer felt like a barrier, it felt like a threshold, something waiting, not to be crossed quickly, but to be understood completely. And for the first time since the key had been placed in her hand, the silence that followed did not separate them. It connected them in a way either of them had planned, but neither of them could ignore. The night did not end with a conclusion, it settled into something quieter, something unresolved yet no longer uncertain, and as the hours passed within the Caldwell estate, the distance that had once defined every interaction between Naomi Brooks and Ethan Caldwell no longer held the same shape. It had not disappeared, but it had shifted, softened at its edges, as if something within it had begun to give way without permission. Morning arrived without announcement, the light stretching across the floor in long, clean lines, and Naomi stood in the kitchen rather than the dining room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had made herself, the simple act deliberate, grounding, a quiet departure from the structure that had been placed around her. When Ethan entered, he paused, not because her presence was unexpected, but because where she stood was, and for a brief moment, the stillness between them carried something new, something that did not belong to routine. "You did not call the staff," he said, his voice even, but lacking the distance it once carried. Naomi shook her head slightly, her gaze lifting to meet his. "I did not need to," she replied. The answer was simple, but it held a quiet assertion, one that did not challenge his world, but did not fully conform to it either. Ethan stepped further into the room, his movements slower, less precise, as if the need to control every detail had loosened its hold, even if only slightly. "You are changing the structure," he said. Naomi tilted her head just enough to acknowledge the observation. "No," she said softly. "I am existing outside of it." The distinction lingered, and Ethan did not immediately respond, his gaze resting on her not as an evaluation, but as something closer to consideration. "You think that makes a difference?" he said. Naomi met his eyes steadily, her voice calm, her tone unwavering. "It already has," she replied. The words were not new, but their meaning had deepened, settled into something that could no longer be dismissed as interpretation. Ethan looked away for a moment, his hand resting against the edge of the counter, the gesture unguarded, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that had not been there before, something quieter, something closer to truth. "I went back last night," he said. Naomi did not move, but her attention sharpened, her presence steady. "To the house," he continued. The words did not need further explanation. Naomi nodded once, her expression unchanged, but her understanding immediate. "It felt different," Ethan said, his gaze unfocused for a brief moment, as if he were seeing something beyond the room. "Not because anything had changed, but because it had been seen." The admission settled into the space between them, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but significant in its simplicity, and Naomi did not interrupt it, did not rush to respond, allowing the truth to exist fully before she spoke. "It was never broken," she said quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but not in resistance, more in recognition of something he had not allowed himself to consider. "No," he said. "It was not." The agreement, though small, shifted something further, something that had been held in place for too long, and for the first time, the space between them no longer felt like something that needed to be maintained, but something that could be understood. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture regaining some of its familiar structure, but the rigidity was gone, replaced by something more grounded, more real. "I do not know what to do with it," he said. Naomi's lips curved just slightly, not into a smile, but into something softer, something that acknowledged the honesty in his words. "You do not have to do anything," she replied. "You only have to stop pretending it is not there." Ethan's gaze returned to hers, steady, searching, and for a moment, the man who stood before her was no longer divided between who he had been and who he had become, but existed somewhere in between, uncertain, but no longer hidden. "And you?" he asked after a moment. "What do you do with something that was never meant to belong to you?" Naomi held his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, her tone clear. "You respect it," she said. "And you leave it where it belongs." The answer settled into him, visible not in reaction, but in stillness, and for a brief moment, the silence that followed felt complete, not empty, not waiting, but full in a way that required nothing more. Ethan took a step closer then, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to acknowledge that it no longer needed to remain as wide as it had been, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter, but carrying a weight that was no longer defined by control. "I did not give you the keys so you would stay outside of it," he said. Naomi's eyes did not leave his, her expression steady, her presence unwavering. "I know," she replied. The understanding between them was no longer unspoken, it existed clearly. Now, not as a resolution, but as a beginning, and as the morning light continued to stretch across the room, illuminating a space that had once been defined by distance, Naomi Brooks and Ethan Caldwell stood within something new, something that had not been written into any contract, something that had not been planned, but something that had already begun, quietly, steadily, and without permission, to change everything.